Afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we're not afraid to deal with things as they are and as they're heading, unlike your mainstream corporate media, who basically just thinks you're a passive listener and they feed you whatever junk they prefer to do, and then try to sell you products in between time. And the thing I would like to deal with this particular show is something that is, well, the future. And I promised this on an earlier show when I mentioned my new book, The Destiny of Our Past. You can look that up on Google. Just type in The Destiny of Our Past. And in it, it's a science fiction thriller set in the era of Noah. That's right. It's set 12,500 years ago, just before the flood, just before the cataclysm that wipes out a very advanced civilization. And no, we're not going to get into the whole Antarctica thing. You see that. I've seen all these things about people, making claims and so forth, even though, ironically, I don't know why I did it, ironically, that's where the civilization of Noah is set, in what is now Antarctica. And, of course, the cataclysm shifts the weather patterns of the Earth, polar shift, and therefore what was a very lush area becomes what it is today, and areas that were under sheets of ice suddenly warm up. So, anyway, the book itself, as all science fiction tends to find one aspect of humanity or issues to deal with. Mine deals with both government, but also, most importantly, biotechnology and eugenics. And the reason I call it the destiny of our past is because I think we're heading that way. I really do. I think that when, for instance, if you're a Christian, you may be familiar with the scripture where Jesus says, when the times are just like, they were in Noah's time, that's when, Jesus returns. And, humans have been evil throughout, ever since the very beginning. Cain and Abel and so forth. Humans have done naughty things, have been very, very evil. Most of the time, not, I think most people are not primarily evil. But the concept that the whole earth was flooded just because people were just, as they are today even, I think is very superficial. And without dealing a whole lot with that whole alternative history thing, I will note that the book of Jasher does say that humans were messing around with the creation and, mixing species and so forth in an attempt to provoke God. Sort of like giving the middle finger to God. And ironically, we have a lot of scientists today who say this. Now, even before that, there was an attempt by Stalin to mix ape DNA with human. And in it, that was going to be his way of kind of dispelling the idea that humans are so special, the special creation of God, and also showing that humans were part of the same species. If you could cross a gorilla or a chimpanzee with a human, then that would show that humans were so close that they were the same species. And, of course, his attempts failed. And he later gave those up, especially when, he was getting his former ally, Nazi Germany, deciding to invade his country, as he had done to Poland. But the the aspect of being able to mix DNA between species is something that's science fact now. Okay, you can look at headlines and see that chimera, mixed human and animal, there's experiments going on today, mostly into the area of xenotransplantation, meaning that you would be able to use organs that were, grown in a pig, but they would be essentially enough of the human host that was going to receive the heart or whatever organ that there would be no rejection. And I kind of deal with that in my book, why the Abrahamic religions banned pork. There's a more scientific reason than just saying, oh well, no, we don't eat pork. Now, let's go from where I think we can say we're at now, generally, and go into the future and see how that's going to change things. Because, again, I'm going to make a reference to my book. In the book, the reason why human beings like Noah live for so long is not because they were designed that way, born that way, naturally. It is because of nanotechnology and biotechnology that allows them to have this, living 8 and 9 or, 100 years or more. So let's just go ahead and begin. And how the new technologies may actually change our society so much that you would never be able to recognize it if you could go into the future, maybe, 100 years? Probably a lot less than that, but let's just say 100 years. Now, we only started with the whole concept of artificial insemination at the end of the 19th century. And, it may have been in the Bible, too. There's, immaculate conception could have been a form of IVF or artificial insemination. But for humans, it started in the late 1800s, where there was a successful pregnancy started. Now, this technology's been around, for a long time. And there are many thousands of people who get pregnant just by inviting a lot of times lesbians or single women, or cases where a husband and wife, the husband's sterile. They invite a friend, make a donation, maybe use a turkey baster, and voila, you've got a baby. And this may, if you would have talked about this 200 years ago, been considered science fiction. Now, it's so commonplace, you may even know someone who's either gotten their children this way, has made a child this way, or is a child that was produced this way and is now grown up and is now your friend, and you have no clue as to what their beginnings were. This is just very, very primitive biotechnology. This is causing reproduction in ways that are not generally the natural way to do it. But this has grown over the years to where it's gone from just artificial insemination to then we get IVF, in vitro fertilization, where the fertilization takes place outside the body. And then there are various forms of this. I'm not going to get into the scientific terms for it, but you can take an egg and you can just mix it with sperm. You can take an egg and inject it with sperm in case the husband has some sperm left, but just not enough. And there's some other techniques that will allow someone to get pregnant. Now, this is something that's been going on for the last few decades. Pretty commonplace. But now we're getting into an era where maybe we can take it a step further. We're getting into an era in which we can perhaps start taking some of that DNA material, okay? Fertilization's not taking place. Maybe all the time, man meets woman, they, get married, and all this takes place quite mysteriously inside her body. No, if it's it's taking place outside the body, then you can have a situation in which you can start playing around with the DNA of that person. Now, already we're starting a process by which, I think in England, where they've approved this, where if someone's suffering certain genetic problems, then you can splice out a little bit of that DNA and replace it with someone's DNA that does not have that problem. Now, in theory, that person's father is still 99.9% their father, but there's that little bit that's not. It could be a donor from anywhere, whether you know the person or not. And this is just a preview of what's going to take place in the future, because as we perfect this, and at the same time we perfect where, which genes cause which behaviors and intelligence and so forth, that is when we can start using DNA as merely a blueprint. And that's when we're going to see the advent of a new eugenics, and where reproduction will cease to be something that is just left up to chance. And this, I think, will change our ethical viewpoints towards it. Now, already, we have this in society, which I think is really funny. We have people talk about, well, if we could start designing children, then won't that just change, won't that just lead to some sort of Hitlerian sort of eugenics? Well, first of all, I would note that Hitler may have had eugenics in his society, but he also banned smoking too, in public places. Now, if we just look at Hitler and think, okay, he supported eugenics, so therefore he symbolizes eugenics, I think that's as wrong as saying, well, if you say we should ban smoking in public places, then that's just Hitler. Okay? I mean, Hitler was also a vegan or a vegetarian, so what, does that mean everyone who doesn't eat red meat is suddenly, some sort of Nazi? No, it does not. And there was a lot of countries, including the United States, that had eugenics laws that were aimed at improving the genetics of the society. Some were racial, most were not. All right? I mean, if you were some poor white dude, and you just didn't quite measure up living in Appalachia, genetically you were on the chopping block too for sterilization. So anyway, without getting too bogged down in history and all that kind of stuff, I just want to say that as time goes on, people are going to stop associating eugenics with Hitler. And also what you're going to have is, as we determine what does what in our genetic code, then it'll cease being, oh my gosh, we're going to design children and all this kind of stuff too. Okay, well, let's use it here and here and here. I mean, think about this. I was reading an article about a university in China that was trying to figure out what DNA patterns seem to exist in the most intelligent people. And they were using samples from China as well as Europe and the United States. And they were trying to figure out, which DNA seems to promote, just basically, a very gifted individual. And, of course, if we look at intelligence as a whole, it's not just one gene. There's not the smart gene, and if you don't get it, you're just not very smart. It seems to be a series of genes that work together. But if you don't have those genes, then you're not going to be one of those super gifted ones, the person that just, ideas come to them very easily. Doesn't mean you can't learn, but it just, some people have a distinct advantage in this area. So, as we learn which genes are associated with this, then we could actually start to manipulate them. Now, we do this we could do this very easy in one respect. You could identify the DNA that's associated with it, and have those kinds of people donate sperm and egg, the ones that have this DNA sequence, because at least they're going to have the genes. Now, where they line up with their new mate, we don't know, but there'd be a much greater likelihood. Now, the interesting thing we should look at, speaking of sperm banks, is don't we support eugenics in a way when it comes to these sperm banks? And when people also, we'll just say fertility clinics in general, because I think a lot of them now, if not most of them, also carry egg cells. A little bit harder to extract, but there are women who are sterile or have problems, and they need an egg cell versus just a, women whose husbands are unable to have kids. But isn't it true that there's some eugenics involved in it? I mean, if you send two people in to a sperm bank, one of them is a medical student who's highly athletic, and the other one is, I don't know, high school dropout, overweight, bald, and short. I guarantee you, the sperm bank's going to take the first one, okay? And that's a form of eugenics. In fact, if you look at catalogs from these places in the United States, many of them will let you search through and like, oh yeah, this person here looks good. Here's their eye color, hair color, skin tone, ethnicity, country of origin, of ancestors. Some of them even, you can have, samples of them talking, and maybe even examples of some of the projects they worked on in high school. Okay? It gets very detailed. I watched one documentary that actually had a sperm bank in Europe that was thinking of doing virtual reality, where if a single woman goes in, she'd be able to meet the person in a virtual situation. So this person, they don't really meet in real life. It's just they, can still talk to one another, but it would be some sort of, very safe situation. And the thing is, before getting bogged down again in this issue, is that yes, usually there is eugenics involved here in getting egg and sperm donors, because you just don't go and say, well, there's a homeless shelter down the street, let's enable the guys there to make some money by donating sperm. I've never heard of that. I don't think that's something that most women would find desirable as father material. And if you think that sounds terrible, ask yourself, would you? Okay, I think that ultimately we see how it really works when, even for someone who's super liberal, who's like, I just want a baby, I don't care what it's like, and and they sound quite, open. When they get into the sperm bank, they're going to be, let's take a look at the catalog here. Okay, won an Olympic medal and has a degree in, and so forth. I guarantee if we had a situation in which a larger number of people used egg and sperm donation, you would see an increase in eugenic thought. So I don't know if that's going to, be the case in the future, where suddenly people are like, whoa, we're our diets and so forth are causing so much sterility and other lifestyle habits that, you have to turn to these kinds of places. I suspect the way people take care of themselves nowadays, I wouldn't doubt it. But ultimately, we're going to see people who, if given the opportunity to use new science when it comes available and is advertised, they'll do it. And if you ban it in one country, people will go to another country to get it. Okay? Just like they do in Europe. There's some countries that have a shortage of donors because they make it to where the person's name is available to the children that they create once they reach 18. So you get rid of anonymous donation, and all of a sudden a lot of guys are thinking, And women too, I suppose. That sounds kind of, I don't know how many, I don't know how many times I want someone knocking on my door 18 years later. But, some people love the idea, but when you do that, usually you get a decrease in donors. And so you have fertility tourism, where people will go from the country where they have the shortage to a country that doesn't have a shortage. And that happens between the countries of Sweden and Denmark. A lot of Swedish women don't want to wait in line, and so they want to know something about the donor, so they go to Denmark to get inseminated. And but I think what's going to happen is initially we're going to come out with ways to manipulate the DNA of our offspring. It's not going to be that much longer from now. And you'll be able to determine your offspring's hair color, eye color, height, intelligence, whether they have good eyesight or not, whether they have diabetes or not, any number of things. And when these come in, who wouldn't take advantage of it? Now, I was asked by my daughter recently, what I thought about this biotechnology thing. And I said that I actually would support it if it's permanent. I wouldn't like it if, for instance, you get, who knows what you would get if after several generations of only altering the characteristic, but not the actual germline of that individual, then, suddenly they have a child naturally with someone who's also been altered all this time, but not through the germline, meaning that you change the DNA early enough that that is passed on to all future generations. Then, who knows what you would get at the end. It's like, I don't think that would be really, really fair to the future generations. So, yes, I would support the idea that you cure problems. Let's say diabetes. Let's say bad eyesight and these kinds of things, so that it's permanent. That the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, they won't have to go in for any special treatment. It's just that DNA has been changed. Now, there are people that are thinking, this is unnatural. Well, so is birth control. Okay? When you use birth control, that is very unnatural. And you can see in populations that, let's say cultures that are very open to birth control, like much of Europe, they use a lot of birth control and they hardly have any kids. Whereas maybe there's a culture, let's say Middle Eastern countries, where they don't necessarily agree with birth control and they have lots of kids. And so that alters the basic gene pool of the human population. You get less of those people that support birth control, more of the people who are negative to it. Okay, so birth control changes our DNA. It changes our genetics. It changes, it wipes out entire family lines. So, when you hear the argument that altering our DNA is wrong because it could change our, it's unnatural to do this. I'm not sure if you can really say that that's unnatural. Also, I knew a guy, speaking of changing DNA, I knew a guy who was very self-conscious about being short. So he only dated women who were the same height as him or taller, because he figured when he got married to one of them that he wanted his sons to be taller than he was. And he married someone that was a little bit taller than him. And it would be ironic if he only had daughters. But the thing is that was directing his DNA. I've heard of people who marry, they really love blue eyes, and they actually make that as one of their criteria for the people they'll date, so that there's a better chance of their children having blue eyes. All right? And so we do this sort of thing anyway. And in kind of a roundabout way, we also concentrate intelligence in certain DNA, because we usually date people who have similar educational or occupational interests and backgrounds, which means that for the most part, we don't have someone who is a nuclear physicist dating someone who works at a bowling alley. All right? The person that works in the bowling alley might be quite intelligent, but there's not that many opportunities for these two people to meet each other. Not most, physicists don't, go out and bowl. That's usually more of a, generally a working class activity. So we do have a concentration there. And usually people will marry people within about, my understanding, it's been a long time since I read this, around 5 IQ points. All right, there's not too much difference in that. You don't usually see someone with an IQ of 140 married to a person with an IQ of 85. So we do concentrate DNA already. But now think about this, though. This could really make a big change in things. What if a couple of people with IQs of 85 win the lottery? Okay? They win the lottery, they have lots of money, and they decide they want their children to be smarter than they are. Well, they could go in, they could have their DNA, manipulated, and then their children that come from these embryos would then be the ones who would be the most, they'd be higher, much higher IQ. And on top of this, you could also use another technique, which I've heard the Chinese have been exploring, at least some scientists there. And that is being able to give a woman a whole bunch of hormones so that she produces 20 or so egg cells. Then you fertilize those egg cells, and then you do a slight biopsy, not enough to harm the egg cell or the embryos that you now have, and you find which ones have the IQs that's very high. So maybe our couple that has an IQ of 85, instead of altering their DNA, they could look at 20 different embryos, and one of them just happens to have DNA that means that child will be super intelligent. And then you would go ahead and implant that one and flush the rest. Now, that sounds very inhuman, but this is the technology that we're coming into. And when people are able to do this, or you could do the same thing with other characteristics, maybe, this one here has a DNA that usually is associated with musical performance. Someone else has a DNA that's usually associated, this and this and this. You've got, some royalty or some politician, and they find out that, which of the embryos has the most likelihood to be a psychopath. So it's like, we'll implant this little tyke here. So the thing is that people would actually start choosing characteristics according to what they felt was the most attractive and desirable. And this, again, would start becoming very similar to how we choose cars. Some people like pickup trucks. Some people like sports cars. Some people like more fancy cars. Some people like very simple cars. Some people, you see what I mean. Some people would choose that their children be extremely beautiful and be very good at music. Others would be like, well, I want my children to be highly intelligent, and I'd like them to have these physical characteristics. So I don't think, this whole thing about, everyone's going to be like blonde and blue-eyed and look like a fashion model. That's not true. Because, for instance, I, for one, am not really big on, blondes. Why would I want my children to be blonde? If I'm not someone who, I actually do have children. At least ash blonde. But you're going to find there are couples that would like, I want our kid to have black curly hair. Someone else, red hair is great. Someone else, blonde. Someone else, really tall. Some, would say, nah, I don't want him to be super tall. There's no need for that. You see what I mean? There's not going to be one standard any more than when you go to a sperm bank that there's only one type of person. The catalogs you can see online, they're different. There's people that have, you have someone with red hair from Scottish ancestry, someone with dark hair from Iran, someone here who's blah, 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 and all the different religions and all that sort of thing. I don't think this coming eugenics is going to change that. Okay, to where everyone just wants one thing. I think you'll have quite a bit of variety. Now, on another thing, when it comes to this particular field of genetics, once we start to determine what genes are associated with long life, that is when we may start being able to manipulate things to where longevity is greatly enhanced. I've heard there's only just a few genes that cause us to age. What if we were able to get rid of those genes, or mitigate them, or in some way modify them to where the human beings, instead of looking towards, maybe 85 as being, the old age before dying, what if you could get to the point where a person could live to be 300 or 400 and they would not age? Okay? That's kind of, I explore that in my book. And that is, I should joke here, I explore that in my book, the destiny of our past. Look it up. But there's a description of Noah. He's not a character that even has any lines in the work, but he's described as looking very young. And if Noah was 600 when the flood started, then would God just have him out there building a boat when he's just all a mess? Looks like he's 90 or 100. If people live to be 900 or 1,000, wouldn't they retain their youth? Maybe never showing signs of aging. Maybe just at some point just dying of one reason or another, but never showing age. So you would never see people with gray hair, wrinkles, slouched over, and these kinds of things. And this is a possibility that we are shooting for. Now, that's one area you could cure aging, is at the genetic level. The other area you could cure it is at nanotechnology. Put microchips. I'm not talking about the kind, for tracking people, but very, 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 very tiny robots that would go through your system. They have nanotech already, all right? So don't think, that's all, science fiction and, warp drive and all that kind of stuff. No, they have nanotech now. Very primitive, at least that's what we think. But you get it to the point where it can go in and repair all your cells at the molecular level. Then you're talking immortal cells. And then you're talking an immortal person. So maybe it'll be a combination, nanotechnology and DNA manipulation. Who knows? But I think that in the future, the idea that people are going to live the same lifespans as they do now is atrocious. I think that's ridiculous. And if you had a biologically advanced society in the past, in mankind's ancient history, do you think that they just stopped at their research and everyone just lives as God made them? I don't think so. So anyway, we've got when we get to this point of curing aging, think about how that's going to change things. Think about how people. This is what caused the whole flood in the first place. People became arrogant towards being able to do whatever they wanted to, and not have to worry that, oh my gosh, if I die tomorrow, I got to face God. Maybe that was one of the reasons. You could reach this. Think about what it would be like if, when you're making plans for the future, your future wasn't determined by, well, I want to do this before I'm 30. Because usually a lot of times when people are young, when they're 18, they think 30 is like middle age and everything's downhill from then. But think of it if, you talk to your grandma and she looks like she's 25 and she's like, yeah, I was a doctor before I decided I'd become a dancer, and then later I decided I wanted to study engineering. Okay, this is how it would change things if our lifespans were very much extended. Now, there's some people that think, no, it's I can't remember who said this, but it's our mortality that forces us to concentrate and do things, and to be able to have a deadline, so to speak. Like if you're in college and they say your term paper's due such and such time, you got to get it done or else you fail the course. I don't think that would hurt us, really. I think what would happen is people would set their own deadlines, and they would still be able to work within that without that whole what Freud called a death anxiety. The whole idea that you're so scared of death, you repress it, but you're also at the same time trying to accomplish things in life before that inevitability catches up with you. And once we get to where we can get into this human blueprint, one way or another, that's when we're going to cure that, and that's when we're going to be able to really, I think, reach for the stars. Now, of course, I dealt with last week the whole biotechnology, the whole artificial intelligence thing. Who knows where that's going? I mean, maybe all of our answers to how we can become immortal and perfected and so forth will come when we develop computers that will actually solve these problems for us. Who knows? Or the computer may just think, oh, well, these guys are a little bit awkward to have wandering around on the earth, and the computers wipe us out. That could happen too. But I think ultimately, when it comes to our biology, or what makes us who we are, that whole thing's going to change dramatically. We're going to see a return to eugenics, although it'll be more of the, in-lab eugenics. We're going to see changes in our social structure, as we might even reach to a point where you don't need men and women anymore to come together to make babies. Maybe a guy could just say, here, let's just take one of my stem cells and make it into an egg cell, and I'll fertilize my own egg cell. That'd be a kind of weird form of incest, but of course, if you can create any cell from a stem cell, and there are people, I've interviewed them on my shows, who have said that in the future you will be able to, like for instance, for women, you'd be able to take eggs, you create egg cells out of just their skin cells. Well, that's going to make these kinds of things possible. And then, of course, we get into the whole transgender thing. I mean, think about where that could go. If we start learning how to maybe change people from, male to female or female to male, but not through hormonal intervention and operations, but actually through changing their DNA, even after they're adults, then that's going to really, a person could freeze some sperm, convert themselves into a woman, might take 7 years or so, and then use that sperm to get themselves pregnant and carry the baby. Who knows? But this is no longer questions that are just these crazy sci-fi type scenarios. These are things that will become possible, that will be debated, and I think will be allowed and implemented, and it will be available to just about everyone in the world in one way or another. Something we need to think about. Will we provoke God? Will we see this as a way that we can become gods ourselves? Like at the end of Ray Kurzweil's documentary, Transcendent Man, where he makes that comment about, not believing in God yet. Well, who knows? We may actually become even more religious when we learn the intricacies of the universe. But that doesn't mean that just because we become more religious, we don't actually choose to rebel at the same time. Maybe that's what maybe not God, but maybe that's what Jesus means about the coming back when things are like they were in the days of Noah. Maybe we're not there yet. Maybe we got a little ways to go. I don't want to be a pessimist. It could go, but it could go both ways. Really good, really bad. It just depends on how we use it. Anyway.